Future of Memory. My name is Roland Shu, and I'm Assistant Director of the Forum on Contemporary Europe at the Friedenscope Institute of International Studies. On behalf of the series co-organizers and co-sponsors, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker and to situate today's lecture within this series. I offer my great thanks to co-organizers Elizabeth Mudimibri and Saikat Majumdar. On our collective behalf, I also express our deepest thanks to Kosana Eram. Not seeing at the moment. So with apologies for the time taken out of your dissertation writing, maybe you don't know that part of it, your expertise and dedication has been such a pleasure to work with, and without you, the series wouldn't be what it is. I also express our thanks to the multiple co-sponsors of this series. A series this ambitious needs multidisciplinary support, and indeed we're grateful to have received this. The program resides at the research unit of the Division of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages, and at the Stanford Forum on Contemporary Europe at the Freeman Spogli Institute. The series is co-sponsored by the Departments of English, History, Comparative Literature, as well as the Center for African Studies, the Program in Modern Thought and Literature, and the Stanford Humanities Center. This new series builds on the success of last year's History, Memory, and Politics series. During this winter and spring, we expand the subjects, the disciplines, and the chances for participation, especially at the symposium. The three co-organizers have designed this series to respond to two challenges, among other priorities. First, there's not a consensus among historians on a definition of the present, nor on the viability of analyzing what one may call the contemporary past. It's a particular challenge to find agreement between communities on what is the necessary critical distance one must have before venturing to analyze the past. The issue of different standards for interpreting contemporary history is fraught with tension, especially when one considers the moral consequences of scholarship and when including communities that face historical crimes and reconciliation. The second challenge concerns this notion of memory, whether it's construed as personal, constructed, or collective. It's been an analytic tool deployed over the past generation for the study of European and American history. Have we used it to death? Is there a new way to use this? And it's particularly intriguing to test whether this tool can be wielded to good effect in the study of globalization. Far from promoting a competition between methods, we invite you to join us throughout the series and at the concluding symposium to take stock of the national differences and theoretical continuities. It's our belief that running this series as a comparative project and in offering the special opportunities for open conversation at the final symposium is our best means to foster an understanding of the importance of historical reconciliation in multiple communities around the globe. Today's lecture is the first of this three-part comparison. Briefly, our next lecture is by Françoise Lyonnais. This will be held on Thursday, the 26th of February at 4 p.m. The third lecture will be by Gauri Vishwanathan. This will be held on Thursday, the 12th of March, also at 4 p.m. And finally, the grand symposium to take stock of what we've learned and where we need to go from here will be on Thursday, April 9th, beginning at 9 a.m. Professor Rev, as well as Françoise Lyonnais, will return, and we'll have other speakers as well as Stanford faculty to respond to the three lectures, which will all be online at our website, at a series website. All of these events will be right here, so consider this the home base for returning to continue to talk about contemporary history and the future of memory. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Istvan Rev, Professor of History at the Central European University in Budapest and Director of the Open Society Archives. Professor Rev, to some of you, needs no formal introduction. His fellowships and awards have taken him to multiple leading institutions and institutes throughout the last decades. Fellowships at the Economic History Department at Karl Marx University of Economics in Budapest, the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, the Getty Research Institute, the Center for Advanced Study at Ann Arbor, the Townsend Center for the Humanities at Berkeley, and as well the Center for the Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences here at Stanford. Among his numerous publications, I highlight that he's the founding editor of the Budapest Review of Books, the curator of 16 exhibitions on topics that we'll be discussing today, numerous articles, most intriguingly, before 1989, an article in Dissent on the advantages of being atomized, which we discussed a little bit this morning, articles in Daedalus, has a long-standing relationship with Representations Journal, edited out of Berkeley, served as guest editor on the special issue on monumental histories in summer of '91, and multiple articles in Representations 91, 95, 98, and in fall 2002. Most interesting as well is a contribution to an anthology on schools of thought edited by Joan Scott and Deborah Keats on retrotopia, which I find a very interesting piece. And finally, this text called Retroactive Justice, The Prehistory of Post-Communism. It's a volume that came out at Stanford University Press. I highly recommend it. It was recommended to me, and it's from this text that we first thought of introducing and inviting Istvan to come to speak with us. And I end with just a brief few sentences here from this text, which I think say better than I can what's at stake in today's themes, in today's lecture. If graves can, and sometimes should be opened, if the solitude of the dead cannot be honored, if the past is not envisioned as being over yet, then the objects, the events, the ideas, and the dead of the past could be revisited and remade, not as doubles, but as if each of them were the original, the real one. The object of my study is the remake, in italics, the remake of the dead, the martyr turned unknown soldier and back again, the criminal who was redeemed as innocent, holy days banalized, cemeteries restructured, and unremarkable figures presented as historical monstrosities, ordinary places rebuilt as sites of honor. My book is not devoted to traces of times gone by or representations of past events, but to phantoms. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Istvan Rev.
Thank you very much, Roland. With your permission, I will start this talk backwards. Originally, I thought to add a coda at the very end to the talk, but despite all my efforts, this talk will be somewhat too long. I thought I would try to summarize the coda as a prelude at the beginning. It would have been possible, or should have been possible, to tell a different story than what I'm going to tell this afternoon to you. As Ian Hacking, the philosopher, convincingly argued in his rewriting The Soul, in the course of the 19th century, new sciences emerged, among them the sciences of memory, neurology, psychology, psychoanalysis, and later on cybernetics, real positive sciences, which were and still are on the knowledge side in the Foucaultian classification. It would not be, and it should not be necessary to draw a dividing line between history and the sciences of memory, characterizing one as a positive, factual science that aims at understanding, and the other as an ethical, aesthetical, or poetical view of reality, the vehicle of re-experience. But this is, unfortunately, what happened. Adherents from both sides accused the other by an epistemological deficit, denying the possibility of positive knowledge one can gain from cultivating the other approach. Taking the knowledge, the sciences of memory seriously should not mean abandoning positive knowledge. In fact, without proper knowledge of the facts of memory, it is difficult, it would be difficult to approach history in a way that would take ethical conduct into serious consideration. The aesthetical, rhetorical, ethical representation of the past is not or should not necessarily be in conflict with historical knowledge. One is in a close proximity of the other. Now, unfortunately, this is not the story I'm going to tell this afternoon. I will tell the story of the other side, a much darker story, so I apologize for that. In 1992, 5 groups representing female victims of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina enlisted Catherine McKinnon, the American feminist legal scholar, best known for her anti-pornography crusades, to bring a lawsuit in New York against Radovan Karadzic with the aims of helping to end the genocide, providing victims with a forum to tell their stories, and making the law more cognizant of persecution on the basis of ethnicity combined with sexuality. After determining that the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia did not possess sufficient enforcement powers, McKinnon brought a lawsuit in a US district court under the 1789 Alien Tort Claim Act. McKinnon argued that commentators had mischaracterized the violence as either rape or genocide, failing to understand it as, and I quote her, continuous both with this particular ethnic war of aggression and with gendered war of aggression of everyday life. She became one of the most unquote, she became one of the most prominent scholars to frame the rapes as a practice of genocide which targeted women because of their sex and because of the ethnic group to which they belong. In the Kadic versus Karadzic case, in which McKinnon served as co-counsel, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals became the first US court to recognize rape as an act of genocide. In the year of 2000, a jury verdict awarded $745 million in compensatory and punitive damages to the Croatian and Bosnian Muslim women and children. In connection with the court case, McKinnon wrote, "The rapes in the Serbian war of aggression against Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia are to everyday rape what the Holocaust was to everyday anti-Semitism. Both like it and not like it at all. Both continuous with it and a whole new departure. A unique atrocity, yet also a pinnacle moment in something that goes on all the time. Women are abused by men in these ways every day in every country in the world. Sex has also been used before to create, mobilize, and manipulate ethnic hatred from the Third Reich to Penthouse," unquote. By highly inflating the number of the victims of mass rape, by contending that rape has a genocidal aspect, McKinnon and other radical feminists played an important role in mobilizing international public opinion and pressing the American administration to intervene in the war, and also to forge an intimate connection between sexual abuse and the Holocaust, and I will return to it later on. The Open Society Archives is a repository of documents of the UN Expert Commission to investigate violations of international humanitarian law in the former Yugoslavia, the so-called Sheriff Basuni Commission, the predecessor of the International Criminal Tribunal in the former Yugoslavia. The collection contains a special and until now restricted series on the mass rapes during the Balkan War. The investigative reports from the Commission were prepared primarily by American experts, mostly psychologists, psychoanalysts, feminist legal scholars, in cooperation with native groups of victims, human rights, and feminist activists. The documents probably tell more about the feminist discourse of the decade between the middle of the 1980s and the 1990s than about the history of the mass rapes in Bosnia. Memory, and especially the impact of recovered memories, figure prominently in the documents. Reading these documents related to mass rapes from the early 1990s in Bosnia evokes strange and distant memories from interviews and descriptions about memories of deferred pain, invisible injuries, besides the visible bruises, scars, and wounds inflicted on the mind, the soul, the self of the tortured women. Most of the reports deal with and scrupulously describe trauma and the so-called post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms, the etiology of the health problems in the Balkan, the alleged causes of psychic and mental pain are close relatives of cases known from contemporary American case studies and diagnostic manuals of the decade between the middle of the 1980s and 1990s. Already in his expression of emotions in man and animals, Darwin suggested that fear is the memory of pain. Fear looks to the past, that's the memory of pain, and to the future, the available options of fight or flight. And in lack of the possibility of either fight or flight, the memory of the past induces grave psychic problems and disturbances in the present. In the middle of the 19th century, as it is so well known, the notion of trauma was originally connected to the Industrial Revolution, to the railway, to railway accidents, to the locomotive, which is not just an object, but an especially strong epic symbol as well, to real physical injuries and their supposed after effects, the shock experienced by certain parts of the body on the occasion of falls or when being struck. But with the advent of the outbreak of the Great Hysteria in France in the 1970s, trauma became transubstantiated and turned into an eminently psychic wound with serious supposed after effects. A new kind of memory was born, mostly unknown before the 19th century, that originated in a previously unidentified psychological state called traumatic, and was connected to a previously unknown kind of forgetting called repression. The reports on mass rapes in my archives, beside arguing for the genocidal nature of the atrocities, aim at documenting and emphasizing the post-traumatic mental and psychic effects of the tortures suffered mostly by Muslim women in Bosnia, the impact of forced and self-inflicted silence, the grave consequences of suppressing traumatic experiences on the perception of the individual in the society, and the negative consequences on self-perception. By the middle of the 1980s, my ambition here is not to try to find connections between the ways individual recollections supposedly work and what Maurice Halbwachs called collective memory, but to survey the map of certain areas of public discourse starting in the middle of the 1980s, at a time when the after effect of the Vietnam War were so sharply felt in the US, at the time when the medical profession became alarmed by the discovered high incidence of child abuse, when radical activists launched a consciousness-raising critique against the functioning of the family, when fundamental religious groups suspected the coming disintegration of the traditional bourgeois family and gave credence to stories of human sacrifice, satanic rituals, in order to mobilize public opinion in defense of the family, when the first serious archival efforts started to collect the memories of the Holocaust from the victims who were slowly dying out, at the time when Gorbachev came into power, when Glasnost started, when archives became slowly accessible for the first time in Central and Eastern Europe, when what is called communism, or what was called communism, started surprisingly but not spectacularly collapse, when the alleged future in the eastern part of Europe unexpectedly turned into past. And now I have to make a long detour. In 1984, in the very year when Pierre Nora published his now classic Le Livre de Memoir, Geoffrey Moussaiev Mason, originally a scholar of Sanskrit language and literature, who later turned to psychoanalysis, published a book with the title Assault on Truth, Freud's Suppression of the Seduction Theory. The book was based in part on the Freud-Wilhelm Fliess correspondence, letters that until then had been left out of the published Freud documents. Altogether, close to 100 letters were omitted from the original English language edition of the correspondence. Mason befriended Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, and Kurt Eisler, the childless elderly director of the Freud archive, who designated the likable and handsome Mason as his successor as the archivist of the Freud archive. Mason was appointed project director in the archive. At this point, however, Mason's interest and career took an unexpected turn with major consequences on my story I'm telling to you here. As I was reading through the correspondence, wrote Mason, I began to notice what appeared to be a pattern in the omissions made by Anna Freud in the original abridged edition. In the letters written after 1897, when Freud was supposed to have given up his seduction theory, all the case histories dealing with the sexual seduction of children had been excised. In 1895 and 96, Freud, in listening to his women patients, learned that something dreadful and violent lay in their past. His preoccupation with the seduction seemingly came, however, to an abrupt end on the 21st of September, 1897, with a remarkable letter to Fliess. In fact, my opinion, continues Mason, Freud had abandoned an important truth, that sexual, physical, and emotional violence is a real and tragic part of the lives of many children. The silence demanded of the child by the person who violated her is perpetuated and enforced by the very person to whom she has come for help. Guilt entrenches itself, the patient's uncertainty about the past deepens, and her sense of who she is undermined. The time has come, continues Mason, to cease hiding from what is, after all, one of the great issues of human history. For it is unforgivable that those entrusted with the lives of people who come to them in emotional pain, having suffered real wounds in childhood, should use their blind reliance on Freud's abandonment of the seduction theory to continue the abuse that their patients suffered as children, unquote. After the publication of the book, Mason was fired from the Freud archive and lost his license as a psychoanalyst. I do not want to over-dramatize the impact of the book, but it played a role in the emergence of the recovered memory movement. A high-profile article was published about him in the New Yorker with the title "In the Freud Archives," followed by an even higher profile court case as Mason sued Janet Malcolm, the journalist who turned the article into a book. At the time of writing the book and giving countless interviews while fighting in court, Mason was engaged to no other than Catherine McKinnon. And although he was the author of the book, its concept, its conclusions can be followed in McKinnon's work and career, even as a lawyer, to the documents in my archive in Budapest. Please do not misunderstand me. I do not want to claim that this obscure former psychoanalyst, who is today a champion of animal rights in New Zealand, and the author of books like When Elephants Weep, The Pig Who Sank to the Moon, The Cat Who Came In From the Cold, was single-handedly responsible for the upsurge of a certain kind of public memory discourse connected to alleged suppressed traumatic memories at the time when communism was at the verge of collapse. What I do want to say is that communism withered away at the moment when claiming the return of the allegedly suppressed seemed to make sense in different parts of the world, when such a claim provided a chance to redescribe the recent past, and such an explanation offered a shield to protect one from the responsibility of non-resistance, of collaboration, of silence. By the time of the collapse of communism, there was a ready-made discursive frame available to any self-reflexive individual who was confronted with the until then unexpected and uncomfortable task of making sense of the past, which somehow did not seem to make sense. As a consequence of a looping effect, glasnost, opening up of the archives, the crumbling of the Iron Curtain, and the wars of communism contributed in turn to the further solidification of this discursive frame. Immediately following the fall of the Berlin Wall, Alice Miller, the noted Polish-born Swiss expert of child abuse, published her Breaking Down the Wall of Silence, the liberating experience of facing painful truths. In the book, according to her own words, I quote her, psychohistorical analysis of such brutal tyrants as Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Nicolae Ceausescu show the obvious links between the horrors of their childhoods and the horrors they inflicted on the world. Unquote. I am interested in the birth of a discursive frame, not in the working or malfunctioning of memory. Let me go back to the story of the mass rape of the Bosnian women. In February 1992, a film was premiered at the Berlin Film Festival with the title Befreier und Befreite, Liberators Take Liberties, by the German documentary filmmaker Helke Sander and the historian Barbara Johr. This is a deeply problematic film about the mass rape of German women by the Soviet army in the last 6 months of the Second World War, especially in April-May 1945 in Berlin and in the Eastern Territories. Sander claims in the film that what happened in Germany at the end of the war was a singular mass event, when, according to her estimate, based on statistical data and her computation, 1.9 million rapes took place in the Eastern Territories, 500,000 in Berlin alone. Sander wanted to make the story of this horrible atrocity public again after very long decades of alleged complete silence. As the narrator of the film, she says, I quote her, everybody knew about it, but still no one talked about it, just like today in Kuwait and Yugoslavia, unquote. The very first words of the film are about Bosnia and the rape of the, about Bosnia and the relevance of the contemporary situation of the events of the past she is about to present. So the history of atrocities at the end of the Second World War has continued via repressed memories, according to this interpretation, up to the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Helke Sander was one of the first persons in Europe to dramatize the rapes in Bosnia-Herzegovina. She started working on the film in the mid-1980s, so although the film belongs to the history and historiography of the 1990s, I'm still talking about the mid-80s, about the time when the forgotten started to emerge on both sides of the Atlantic, in Omarska, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in Berlin. In 1985, Claude Lanzmann released his film, The Shoah. The text of the film was published in English with Simone de Beauvoir's introduction, and by that time, not only the Holocaust as a unique, barely representable limit case event became firmly established, not only the Holocaust victim became an uneradicable figure of our common recent history, but the survivor syndrome, the extended moodness triggered by the traumatic memories, became an available way of presenting one's history in public. Following the extended long silence after the liberation of the camps, after the Eichmann trial and Hannah Arendt's book Eichmann in Jerusalem, we have now a seemingly unending, enormous flow of Holocaust memories, audio and video archives, including the Fortune of Video Archive at Yale, the archetype of the Oral History Archive, and the model of Spielberg's Shoah Archive that now contains 52,000 multi-hours long personal interviews, centralized and dispersed archives, repositories, museums, talking monuments, etc. At this very moment, the House of Terror in Budapest is being immersed in an effort to conduct more than 30,000 oral history interviews on the crimes of communism, to compete with the Spielberg Archive, with the oral history collections of the Holocaust Memory Museum in Washington, with the repository at the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, to prove that the crimes of communism were not just commensurate with the crimes of the Nazis, but they were deeper, forced a longer silence, left the survivors with more serious emotional problems, which are more difficult to cope with than the memories of the camps. But this truly remarkable outpouring and overproduction of memories and recollections are still intimately connected to secrecy, to the inability to speak, to silence. There is a quasi-scientific conviction popularized by so-called trauma theorists who assert that the trauma experienced by one person can be passed on to others. I quote one such expert: "The history of a trauma in its inherent belatedness can only take place through the listening of another." According to trauma confession and testimony theorists, the Shoah makes the testimony happen as a second Holocaust event that does not end. What the Holocaust requires, according to these theorists, is a way of transmitting it, not the normalizing knowledge of horror, but horror itself. The character of the traumatic experience, its alleged belatedness, the fact that it is supposedly experienced too late, only after the fact, that what comes through is not what happened, but instead an entirely second-hand phenomenon, makes the transmission of the trauma supposedly intergenerationally possible. Instead of understanding it, according to these experts, one should experience the past. What follows from this moralizing and apocalyptic understanding of traumatic memory is that, for example, Jewish identity is understood to depend on the identification with the narrative of the Holocaust. And this is equally true both in the cases of childhood traumatic memories and the Holocaust, which is an event outside the range of normal human experience, as the American Manual of Mental Illnesses defined post-traumatic stress disorder. Around the time when the last political prisoners were quietly released from the Soviet prisons in 1989, the year when Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago could be officially published for the first time in the Soviet Union, there was already a well-established way how people even in the eastern part of Europe could present themselves to themselves and also to others as survivors of bad times who have just regained their voice belatedly after the fact, who have been forced into muteness, into disguise, collaboration, and only the hidden transcript of their real self could be preserved in a disfigured form under the surface. It was in 1989, the year where communism collapsed, that Pavel Levitsky, the cognitive psychologist, wrote in connection with implicit memory, I quote him, "What you don't know about what you know affects your behavior more than what you think it does," unquote. What counts is not so much competitive victimology, rather than survivorship. Under this description, most of us are survivors. Survivors of incest, mass rape, domestic violence, second, third generation Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, communism, the Vichy syndrome. We are survivors of history carrying thick secrets in ourselves. Memoropolitics, wrote Ian Hacking, is above all the politics of the secret, of the forgotten event that can be turned, if only by strange flashbacks, into something monumental. It is a forgotten event that can be memorialized in a narrative of pain. We are concerned less with losing information than with hiding it, unquote. One feature of modern sensibility is dazzling in its implausibility. The idea that what has forgotten is what forms our character, our personality, our soul. As a consequence of long decades of politically motivated, ideologically sanctioned, centrally censored, officially published writing of history in the eastern part of Europe, memory became seen as a tool to unmediated access to the past. The source of authenticity, the guarantor of the presence of the past. Memory became hailed as a tool of retroactive resistance against the tyranny of facts. The sensibility of the times in the West, with its efforts to foreground mourning, healing, witnessing, testimonials, contributed to the emergence of the overproduction of until then allegedly lost traumatic memories in the former communist world. In East and Central Europe, we have, even 20 years after 1989, a scarcity of visible objects, places, relics that are connected to the fall of the wall of communism. There were no real revolutions in any of the former communist countries, just negotiations and dubious-looking compromises behind the closed doors, round tables, alleged coups, peaceful transitions, democratic elections. Except in Germany, where indeed the wall fell, and the ruins, fragments of the wall, or the photograph of Rostropovich playing the cello in front of the wall serve as a memorial of the fall. We do not have monuments commemorating the transition. We do not even have the right suggestive term of the moment of the change. The old regime and the new are somehow separated, but we do not quite know the way how to get hold of it. Even after 20 years, we are uncertain about the nature of the changes. We cannot point at the key of the Bastille as the proof of the momentous changes, as the relic of our own involvement in the dismantling of the Ancien regime. We did not take part in it. We were left out, missed the moment. We cannot remember of what happened. We do not have memories that would make sense. Our ability to recall is inextricably lined with our assumptions about how the world is. And if there is a visible incongruence between the claims of an alleged revolution which undid the communist regime and the present state of the world, there is no context in which to remember. As Moses Finley, the scholar of Greek antiquity, stated, I quote him, "Memory is controlled by relevance." Except the memory of a few extraordinary but still fading events, we do not have real memories connected to the transition. As François Furet writes in his Passing of an Illusion, compared with Napoleon, who founded a state that would last for centuries, the Bolshevik Revolution ended up by leaving nothing behind, neither principles nor laws, nor institutions, nor even a history, unquote. Now, how can you remember the void? How can you find a historical context for the recollections of one's life outside history? Communism had no normal history, only promises. It could not be held responsible for anything as it has never been fully itself yet. It has always just been on its way to becoming its real self. Life was lived out of the context, out of context. Naturally, all of us who were born before the middle of the 1980s have memories of our lives during the time when the communist regimes ruled. But those recollections exist outside a firm, tangible frame in which the recalled incidents would find a distinct, intelligible location in a normalized historical continuity. Overnight, the promises have gone. The alleged future became part of the past, and how can one remember the future that never was? For John Locke, a person is constituted not by a biography, but by a remembered biography. But as Alan Young contends in his The Harmony of Illusions, inventing post-traumatic stress disorder, our sense of being a person is shaped not simply by our active memories. However, it is also a product of our conceptions of memory. What happens then when we have no biography to remember, but still have a definite conceptions about how memory works? No real memories, but a firm knowledge about memory, the frame, that's what we have. Does this sound implausible? Let me give you an example that is relevant both to the memory of the Holocaust and the alleged memory of communism. Hungary had an exceptional place among the countries that had the misfortune to experience the Holocaust. While the Jewish population of the countryside was deported in the early summer of 1944, and more than 430,000 people perished in Auschwitz, every third Jewish victim of Auschwitz was Hungarian, the Jewry of the capital, as a result of historical coincidences, survived, mostly in the Budapest ghetto. Altogether, more than 100,000, mostly assimilated Jews survived the Second World War, people who for the first time in their lives became confronted with their own Jewishness at the moment when the authorities forced them to wear the yellow star of David. After the war, not only the perpetrators, but the victims too, who before the war had a firm conviction, that they were not Jews but Hungarian citizens, wanted to leave the terrible memories of the past behind. The Communist Party, the leaders of which were in large part also assimilated Jews themselves, offered the Jews the chance to abandon the Jewish identity that had been forced on them against their own will by the interwar regime. The offer was to leave forced Jewishness behind while remaining firmly anti-fascist. According to communist history writing, anti-Semitism and race hatred were just a mask on the face of fascism, whose real enemies were no others but the communists. The history of the 20th century, according to this reading, was a constant struggle between anti-communist fascists and anti-fascist communists. The Holocaust remained a non-issue in the communist world even after the discovery of Auschwitz in Israel and in the United States, in the West, after the first third of the 1960s. The concentration camps in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the GDR became retrospectively populated with political prisoners, anti-fascists, mainly of communist persuasion. Even the dead Jews became eliminated from the camps. A disproportionately high number of Jewish survivors in Hungary, but also in some of the other East and Central European countries, joined the Communist Party or became a supporter of the regime. The silence that surrounded the fate of the Central European Jewry was not just officially induced. It would be highly misleading to characterize the situation as Kundera does in his book of Laughter and Forgetting, as if, I quote him, the struggle of man against power would be the struggle of memory against forgetting. No, there was a willing collaboration here. Neither those in power nor the surviving victims of the Holocaust wanted to remember, to keep the memories of victimization alive. The Holocaust remained a taboo, I would add, together with the fate of Freud and psychoanalysis, almost until the very end in most of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Freud returned to the East only with the collapse of communism. Communism buried under its ruins the promise that it would save the world from the return of evil, of fascism. After 1989, extreme right-wing parties became resurrected, open anti-Semitic slogans and inciting together with high-profile neo-Nazi groups invaded the public space, and the unprepared, surprised anti-fascists and their children of Jewish origin remained there almost alone, frightened and helpless. At this point, large number of these people, some of them former Marxist philosophers, journal editors, or just simple former party members and their children, discovered the Holocaust. not the once buried personal experiences, not the personal loss of human dignity, the lost relatives, the smoke of the gas chambers, the barely imaginable horrors. No. What they discovered was the Western construct of traumatic Holocaust memories, the construct of the unique, unrepresentable event, a tapestry waved from Paul Celan's poems, the Yad Vashem, the Washington Holocaust Museum, the emblem of the unspeakable, the long-buried secret. By the time of the collapse of the communist regime, the Holocaust became a highly respectable Western import, a ready-made, usable frame in which one's lost life could be readily reframed. As Alain Finkielkraut, the French philosopher, could write it already in 1980, I quote him, "The Judaism I had received was the most beautiful present a post-genocidal child could imagine. I inherited a suffering to which I had not been subjected, for without having to endure oppression, the identity of the victim was mine. Without exposure to real danger, I had heroic stature. To be a Jew was enough to escape from anonymity, indistinguishable from others, and the dullness of an uneventful life. I possessed a considerable advantage over the other children of my generation, the power to dramatize my biography," unquote. There is a strange revival in Central Europe, the return of he who never was, the generic and authentic Holocaust victim, he who has never before thought of himself as one of them, the survivor of double traumas, that of fascism and communism, which forced him to repress the memories and trust fake prophets who offered false promises. The Holocaust survivor is a respected identity, surely more respectable than the identity of the former party members. After the collapse of communism, the Holocaust provided an ecological niche that could be readily occupied by those who, having no other choice, by its help, could bracket the decades of communism that did not lead to anywhere, almost as if it has never been, save the imposed silence on the traumatic after effects of the Shoah, privileged among them the inability to speak about what had happened. The Holocaust provided a solution at the moment when, in the wake of existential anxieties, it became imperative to find a new past on which a new, usable, seemingly continuous, although pastless identity could be built. The born-again Hungarian Holocaust survivor, the only authentic witness, according to the theory of second-hand witnessing, is not an unprecedented creature. Nathan Zuckerman, known from Philip Roth, the ghostwriter, is a typical example of the Holocaust Jew who fantasizes of marrying Anna Frank, the incarnation of the Holocaust herself, or at least a Czechoslovak actress who, although not Jewish, played Anna Frank in Prague, in Eastern Europe, the longed-for Jewish homeland of actual victims and survivors. If Jewish identity is understood as identification with the narrative of the Holocaust, if survivorship, according to trauma theory, could be transmitted, inherited, experienced after the fact, even without having been there, then it is pointless to criticize Sylvia Plath for her poems like Daddy, where she imagines her suffering as if she had been a victimized Jew. Plath, who later killed herself by gas, referred to the poem as, and I quote her, as is spoken by a girl with an Electra complex. Her father died while she thought he was God. Her case is complicated by the fact that her father was also a Nazi, and her mother very possibly part Jewish, unquote. By the help of the Jungian concept of the Electra complex, Plath connects the Holocaust with an aberrant father-daughter relationship in childhood. Sylvia Plath's Electra complex recalls the real-life story of a certain Karen Milius from Halle, Germany, A Christian woman, the daughter of an SS officer, who after the death of her father becomes a rabbi of a Jewish congregation in East Germany and decides to bury the father in the Jewish cemetery. Milius's case emerged at a conference organized at the Moses Mendelssohn Center in Potsdam with the title The Wilkomirski Syndrome, Invented Memories or the Longing to be a Victim, triggered by the strange case of Benjamin Wilkomirski's alleged childhood Holocaust memoir, Fragments. Fragments, Memoirs of a Childhood, 1939-1945, was published by Surkamp in 1995, then immediately translated into English and awarded by the American National Jewish Book Award, the Jewish Quarterly Prize for Non-Fiction, among other prizes. The book was hailed by critics and scholars alike, among them Elie Wiesel and Deborah Lipstadt, as the exemplary, authentic voice of the survivor. In 1997, the New York Times selected Fragments as one of the notable books of the year. It seemed as if the author had followed the received wisdom coming from the best-known trauma and testimony experts, among them Dori Laub and Shoshana Fellman, who asserted in their jointly authored study on testimony, and I quote them, as a relation to events, testimony seems to be composed of fragmented and broken form, of bits and pieces of a memory that has been overwhelmed by occurrences that have not settled into understanding or remembrance, acts that cannot be constructed as knowledge nor assimilated into full cognition, events in excess of our frames of reference. It is no wonder that these experts found Fragments so compelling and authentic. For Wilkomirski, who obsessively read all available works on the Shoah, by writing his book, faithfully followed the established conventions of Holocaust testimonies, the literature of genocide as a genre, canonized by those same authors, who in turn happily recognized in Wilkomirski's book a further and unmistakable proof of the correctness of their theories. Wilkomirski claimed in the book that he had been forced to lose his father and mother tongues. His language, as he said, was just the imitation of other people's speech. Whose language is not an imitation of other people's speech? This is why his memories remained unspeakable for 50 years. Not long after the publication of Fragments, a Swiss writer, Daniel Gansfried, himself unfortunately the writer of an unsuccessful Holocaust memoir, the son of a Holocaust survivor, uncovered that Wilkomirski was born as Bruno Grosjean, not in Riga, Latvia in 1939, but in Switzerland in 1941. He was taken away from his unwed mother, the survivor of possibly intergenerationally transmittable traumatic experience, as she had lain in hospital for almost half a year before the birth, after being knocked off her bicycle by a motorist and left severely injured. When she emerged from coma after half a year in hospital, the doctors told her that she was pregnant with Bruno. Bruno was adopted by the Dösekers, an upper-middle-class family in Zürichberg, and he became obsessed by Christianity, painted religious painting figuring the Virgin Mary, but in his early 20s, he started to tell people that he came from a Polish family of musicians and visited Krakow and Auschwitz. He became a clarinetist and a music instrument maker. In Krakow, once he went to a concert of the well-known violinist Wanda Wilkomirska, and when somebody pointed at the similarity with the musician, he decided that with his lost sister he found himself, decided using the Wilkomirski name, and started recalling that he was a survivor of Majdanek and Birkenau. We know that Wilkomirski, when writing about his alleged experiences as a child in Poland, was heavily influenced by Jerzy Kosinski, his best-selling book, The Painted Bird. As Wilkomirski described it, the most touching and most shocking thing I had ever read, which, although published as fiction, was encouraged by the author to read as personal memoirs of events that he had not personally experienced. The Wilkomirski saga is not unique. Just a few weeks ago, as you might be able to recall, Herman Rosenblatt's story made headlines in the American media when his book, Angel at the Fence, identified as a completely fictitious Holocaust memoir, was withdrawn by the publisher just weeks before publication. In February last year, Le Soir, a Belgian newspaper, revealed what had been suspected already for quite some time, that Misha de Fonseca's best-selling childhood chronicle, Misha, a memoir of the Holocaust years, was written by Monique de Waal, a Christian woman whose biography had nothing to do with the facts reported in her fake autobiography. My interest here is not the imposter Wilkomirski or similar fraudulent Holocaust accounts, by the process whereby the public reception of the Holocaust changed gradually from shameful taboo to hallowed icon, and with that change, the reaction to stories of survival changed as well. Fragments that testifies to an absence of events never experienced by the chronicle is a perfect demonstration of the idea of the discursive frame of traumatic memories. The long recognized weakness of memory, its partial, fragmented, elusive nature, are turned into virtue, and in opposition to history, understood as cold, objective, factual, retrospective, insensitive, formalized mode of understanding, memory, testimony, witnessing are hailed as the presence of the past, the means to re-experience that what had not been or allegedly could not be experienced in the first place. When the city of Zurich awarded Wilkomirski with a prize, he said, "This is a sort of rehabilitation through the Swiss government." The time of writing Fragments in Zurich coincided with a heated debate about the role Switzerland played during the Second World War. It was a crisis of national self-assessment regarding Switzerland's wartime history. In response to the international controversy that focused most visibly on the Swiss banks, the Swiss government set up two international committees of experts, the so-called Volcker Commission, led by Paul Volcker, who is currently the chairman of the newly formed Economic Recovery Advisory Board set up by President Obama, and the Bergier Commission, established by the Swiss Parliament, that besides analyzing Swiss business dealings during the war, was commissioned to study Swiss refugee politics during the Second World War as well. Writing about Switzerland, Wilkomirski observed in his book, I quote him, "The camps still there, just hidden and well disguised." As if responding to this allegation, the former Swiss president remarked in an interview, "From the way certain people talk, I sometimes wonder whether Auschwitz isn't located in Switzerland," unquote. Identity is not biologically based. This is what theorists of trauma over-dramatize. In Fragments, delusional Wilkomirski's narrative evolved into his life. It is understandable that he was longing for a life that was relevant for the history of the century, not for the comfortable, perhaps boring life of a Swiss. We can fully understand this ambition to overcome the incongruence between the drive to witness something monumental and the uneventful existence in Switzerland by recalling one of Christian Boltanski's archival installations entitled Dead Swiss. The French visual artist collected obituaries, newspaper clippings, from a Swiss regional newspaper. According to tradition, the obituaries were accompanied by photographs, snapshots, or studio portraits of the recently deceased Swiss. Boltanski cut the photographs, reshot, enlarged them, and exhibited the hundreds of photos installed as if an archive without commentary. When asked about the intention behind the seemingly unremarkable work, Boltanski said, "Before I did pieces with dead Jews, but dead and Jew go too well together. There is nothing more normal than the Swiss. There is no reason for them to die, so they are more terrifying in a way. They are us." It is no wonder that in the course of his post-publication wanderings, book launches, public appearances at the Salzburg Festival, the Oprah Winfrey Show, Wilkomirski at one point found himself confronted in a literal sense with the superimposition of the Holocaust over supposed traumatic childhood memories of abuse. In a Los Angeles synagogue, a woman who called herself Laura Grabowski grabbed surprised Wilkomirski, hugged him, and announced that they had been close childhood friends in the camp and later on in a Krakow orphanage. "He is my Binya, that's all I know," she proclaimed in front of the television camera. Without hesitation, Wilkomirski confirmed the memories of Laura Grabowski, a survivor of Auschwitz, a Polish Jew who was experimented on with everlasting consequences by Joseph Mengele. The alleged child survivor, however, came to this world as Laurel Wilson in Tacoma, Washington State. Laurel Wilson, under the alias Lauren Stratford, was the best-selling author of Satan's Underground, the extraordinary story of one woman's escape, published in 1991, in which she describes her illegitimate birth, her rape by her adoptive father, her abusive mother, child pornography, sadomasochism, child prostitution, brainwashing, satanic rituals, sacrifice of newborn babies, including one of her children, while the other two were killed in snuff films. Poor Maurice Sendak, author of Where the Wild Things Are, who knows one or two things about children, said of Wilkomirski's book, "These broken fragments slice into the soul and draw blood. More than justice, fine art is rendered in these unsmoothed out memories. All children, most importantly Holocaust children," asserted Maurice Sendak, "are finally vindicated." He wrote this on the jacket of the 1996 US edition of the book. The child survivor is the perfect case to demonstrate the intimate genealogical relationship between supposed early traumatic memories and the Holocaust testimony in the formation of memory as a discursive frame. The event, like the Holocaust, that is outside the range of usual human experience, supposed to produce disrupted or impossible reference in language. On the other hand, as the trauma experts assume, we cannot have direct access to the history of others in general, and in particular to history of others who, as a result of the traumatic experience, are numb, muted, cannot speak. Children, the most innocent among the innocent victims, cannot speak because they are children, because the experience always comes after the fact, too late, because they are supposedly forced to suppress the memories which they cannot experience anyway. Wilkomirski ended up first in an orphanage, then lived with foster parents, so irrespective of the lack of his experiences in Birkenau or Majdanek, irrespective of the fact that he was brought up by an upper-class couple in the best part of Zurich, he should be considered a traumatized, abused child. His personality, his disturbed psyche, all his problems are related to and should be explained by memories of early childhood abuse. As Alice Miller, the noted and notorious Swiss psychotherapist, herself a self-confessed child abuse survivor, the author of numerous books, among them The Drama of the Gifted Child, noted in her distinguished lecture for the 21st Annual International Psychohistorical Association Convention in New York, and I say this in order to prove that she is not a person on the fringes. So she said, I quote her, "Benjamin Wilkomirski, the author of a harrowing and intensely illuminating book about his childhood in the concentration camps, once confided to me in a personal encounter some observations made with the eyes of an imprisoned but extremely wide-awake child on the behavior of the female camp guards. He said that it had taken him 50 years to inquire who those women were, women who had so openly and unreservedly relished the job of tormenting and humiliating Jewish children and subjecting them to every conceivable variety of mental and physical cruelty." Alice Miller makes Dr. Daniel Gottlieb Moritz Schreber, the author of the Ärztliche Zimmergymnastik from 1855, personally responsible for Wilkomirski's supposed personal sufferings and for the Holocaust in general. According to Miller, Schreber, a Prussian pedagogical expert in the middle of the 19th century, introduced and popularized pedagogical methods in 2 generations before Hitler's rise to power that served as the morale and educational foundations for Hitler's plans of the Endlösung. Some of Schreber's tracts run to as many as 40 editions, in which he presented child-raising methods that, in Miller's reading, equal to a systematic instruction of child persecution. The children systematically subjected to obedience drill around the turn of the century were not only exposed to corporal correction, but also to severe emotional deprivation. The best the children could hope for, was to find some kind of substitute from the servants, who, in numerous cases, used and exploited them as objects of pleasure, thus frequently adding to the children's emotional confusion. Present-day neurobiology research makes it easier for us, continues Miller, to understand the way the Nazis, like Eichmann, Himmler, Höss, and others functioned. The rigorous obedience training they underwent in earliest infancy stunted the development of such human capacities as compassion and pity for the sufferings of others. It is my belief that only men and women who had experienced mental and physical cruelty in the first weeks and months of life and had been shown no love at all could possibly have let themselves be made into Hitler's willing executioner. With Alice Miller, we almost came full circle. The repressed memories of child abuse are not just like traumatic memories of the Holocaust. Child molestation does not only shed light on the Shoah, but child abuse and especially the repressed memories of early childhood traumatic memories are, according to these experts, the cause, the root of the Holocaust itself. We are not only witnessing, if I may say so, the analogy between disrupted reference on the one hand and the impossibility of direct access to the history of others on the other, but we have in front of us the claim that the one is the consequence of the other. The Holocaust is a symptom of the arch secret, the repressed memories of child abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. About 5:30, then we have a reception recess. Questions for Professor Rev?
Well, just a comment. It's an amazing exploration of fairly contemporary history, and I really am fascinated by the story you tell. Can't wait to be able to read the paper in more detail.
Is this scheduled for publication?
Yes, it's very, very long at this point.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the paper, and I was especially intrigued by the notion you brought up of inherited memory, where you inherit the memory of a trauma you did not experience yourself. And you know, I mean, it happens all the time with subsequent generations of people born of, you know, by the Holocaust, partition, riot, war. And what I was wondering is, what happens to the body? What happens to the physical dimension when memory is inherited as a kind of a cultural legacy? When the original event has a very striking physical dimension. Is there a way that physical dimension of the memory can also be passed on, or that just sort of doesn't remain a part of that memory at all?
Perhaps I was not clear enough. I'm not an expert. I don't know whether memories could be inherited. I have grave doubts about that. What I tried to recapitulate here are very popular and highly influential ideas of historians, psychologists, neurologists, certain experts of trauma. I quoted mostly American authors, although not exclusively. And perhaps it's possible to say that I am biased. So in order to answer your question, let me recall the work of a Hungarian-born famous psychoanalyst couple, Nicholas Abraham and Maria Török, who influenced Derrida very much, who are the most influential authorities behind the idea of transgenerational inheritance of memory. And Nicholas Abraham, in one of his essays, wrote about a child who had a mother whose lover, secret lover of the mother, had been killed by gas in the camp. And it was a secret in the family, according to this description, for all sorts of reasons, because of the Holocaust and because he was a lover. And when Nicholas Abraham writes this story up, he asks the following question: what does our man, this is the child who grows up with this secret, what does our man do on weekends? A lover of genealogy, he catches butterflies in order to kill them in a can of cyanide. Now, this is a very strange story, but those experts who believe in the transmissibility of memories, some of them also think that what happens here is, going back to Freud, acting out these inherited memories. They act them out, and here is the secret which haunts the family, and the child acts out this secret by killing the butterflies in a way similar to the way how the lover of the mother had been killed. So what I wanted to tell you this afternoon is that there are these very strange mosaics, elements, from which a relatively comprehensive frame was built. Starting sometime in the last third of the 19th century, but I concentrated on the story around the middle of the 1980s. And these are elements of this frame, the supposition that it is possible to inherit memories, for example. And as I tried to say at the beginning of this talk, I decided to present this darker side of the story. I don't want to claim that this is the only story one can tell about the development of memory with a capital M as a discursive frame. And as a historian, I've learned a lot from the so-called memory sciences. But this is a deeply upsetting development, something which impregnates so much our culture. And I think this is very, very dangerous and counterproductive for our understanding of history. And this is why there is this real cultural clash between historians and memory activists who come from legal profession and from psychology and so on. So this is the story and its relevance to East and Central Europe, which I tried to present here. These are not my views.
Istvan, the attraction of turning yourself into one of the victims, though you yourself were not a victim, seems to some extent the result of indeed our overall emphasis on victim status in politics, etc. And I'm wondering, as you have thought about these matters, to what extent do we have similar phenomena that almost border on the fraudulent, like the last stories you told, in earlier times? And that gets me to the more complicated question of where is the line to just pure fraud in the world?
Now, what I try to argue is that what came into being and became so popular after the mid of the 1980s is not simply the victim, but perhaps much more the survivor. And there is a difference between the victim and the survivor. The survivor, despite all odds, endures and manages to survive. It's not pure luck, but somehow there is a secret center of the personality which helps despite everything. And this is what is emphasized here. Although I was mute and I was unable to talk, there was strength secretly inside me, and I managed to survive. Now, I think that it is possible to say that there have always been impostors who, for whatever gain, pretended something else than what they had been. But I'm more interested in the context in which it is easy to get credence with such frauds. When there is a receptivity for that, and there is a genre, and you know how to write fragments and bits and pieces and leave out things and provide absence because it makes you believable. The less believable you are, the more believable you still become as a result of this canon which had been built up by these experts. And this is what I was more interested in. And I think that by the help of this literary canon, it became easier for the people who were looking for solution, how to present themselves in public and to themselves, to find the raw material which they can use in films, in literature. This is enormously successful genre. Hollywood movies and best-selling books. And I really think that there is a very deep relationship between the secrets, alleged secrets of the child and the alleged secrets of the traumatized individual. And one serves as the model for the other. And I think that the child, because this is what has been with us from the birth of empirical psychology in the middle of the 18th century in Germany, the extreme importance of the memories of the child, the arch secret of the child. Just let me read one short paragraph by Carl Philipp Moritz, who was one of the founders of empirical psychology, the founder of the first psychological journal in Germany, who said that could it be that the ideas from childhood are the thin and imperceptible ribbon that connects our present state with the past state, when that which constitutes ourself now at one time was present under different circumstances. He writes this in 1783. And he writes, from time to time I have allowed my fantasy, the game, to look back to those earliest years of childhood, up to the point where it seems as if one were about to lift an impenetrable curtain cast before one's eyes. But without knowing how and without even noticing it, one always wanders off, and the secret remains for the child.
Actually spread this idea of childhood oppressed memories to Hungary and to the current Hungarian situation. If you think about this, or if we think about this in Hungary, the current political leader and anyone who has a significant role was a child during the communist era. And during the communist era, somehow Hungarians learned to oppress their own memories and learned to, a sort of a personal censorship. And that affected how they are interacted with the world in school, in public, in work. You had this limit, what you were able to tell to others and what you were not. These are the leaders who are now. How this reflects to the future of the country, what would you say?
I don't know how it reflects the future, but perhaps what I did was not a just thing to do, concentrating so much on Jewish memories, because what I try to reconstruct here is equally applicable or equally used by other groups as well. Ordinary Hungarians who say that although it seems that we had been collaborators, we were collaborators during the decades of communism. This is just an optical illusion. We had resisted communism already before, in advance, at the River Don, when the blind West was unable to see what was coming, that the Bolsheviks would come. But we, based on our historical experiences, and because we were in the vicinity of the Soviet Union, we were able to foresee what was coming. So we resisted before the fact. So nobody should accuse us of collaboration. We have always been resistors, the bastions of Christian Europe all the time. So this is very similar to what I've tried to do. We are survivors of the Second World War, of the trenches at the River Don. We are the survivors of communism. And now we try to continue our genuine, real, authentic history from the moment where we had to stop after the Second World War. So this is a general phenomenon. You can find it in Russia. We are Russians. Who are the Soviets? The Soviets invaded us. We were forced to live under the Soviets. And I think that this is an ingenious construct. It really can help us a lot when we are confronted with a situation when it seems it is so difficult to make sense of our own life of the past.
Some of it has, it seems to me, something to do with a more primitive, pragmatic psychology, and that is, so here you were part of the communist system, and you have to create some way of being able to live with that, improve it, and in particular when the whole thing is over, everybody will look at you with suspicion, and so you create, as so many other people under less trying circumstances, a somewhat heroic a past for yourself, which is just a very instrumental psychology that is far removed from what you mostly emphasized in your paper.
I think that you are absolutely right. On the other hand, what I try to reconstruct here are very sophisticated or sophisticated looking ideas by serious or serious looking scholars with very high credentials. And I don't want to say that what the ordinary Hungarian or Czech turns to is a gesunkenes Kulturgut. But in a sense, yes. Because the films we watch on television, in the movie theaters, the popular novels we read, are very much influenced by popularized, simplified versions of these partly deconstructive ideas coming from Yale, for example. I don't want to say that there is a direct link between the Yale French department, Shoshana Fellman, for example. But I'm not very far from saying that.
Well, thank you so much. And we have a reception. Can you please join me in thanking them?
Thank you very much.